Windsor, Ontario. February 12, 1920, 11:47 p.m. 8 Ford Model T trucks idle in formation behind the Hiram Walker and Sons distillery on Riverside Drive East. The temperature sits at 14 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Ice fog rises from the Detroit River, which has been frozen solid for 6 consecutive days. The lead truck carries 240 cases of Canadian Club whiskey. 7 identical vehicles follow, each loaded with the same cargo. The convoy represents 1,920 cases total, the largest single alcohol shipment ever attempted across the international border by motor vehicle. James Mackenzie adjusts his wool coat and checks his pocket watch. The 34-year-old former Ford assembly line worker turned smuggler walks between the trucks, examining each load. The wooden crates bear legitimate export stamps from the Canadian government. Under current Canadian law, shipping alcohol to foreign destinations remains perfectly legal. The problem lies 1,100 yards across the frozen river, where American Prohibition agents patrol the Michigan shoreline. The Volstead Act took effect 23 days ago. On January 17, 1920, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal throughout the United States, but Canadian distilleries continue operating at full capacity. Hiram Walker produces 30,000 gallons of whiskey daily. Most of it sits in warehouses waiting for export to European markets. Mackenzie negotiated a purchase price of $8 per case, $15,360 for the entire load. In Detroit speakeasies, each case will sell for $85. The potential profit exceeds $163,000. Frank Sullivan supervises the loading from his position near the distillery's main gate. The 41-year-old former Detroit police sergeant lost his job for taking bribes from saloon owners. Now he works for Mackenzie, organizing the logistics of cross-border smuggling. Sullivan recruited the drivers from unemployed auto workers. Each man receives $200 for the night's work, more than most earn in 2 months at the Ford plant. The drivers wear identical black wool coats and fur-lined caps. They carry no identification. If arrested, they will give false names and claim ignorance about their cargo. The trucks display Michigan license plates stolen from abandoned vehicles in Detroit junkyards. 3 mechanics spent 2 days modifying the Model Ts for winter river crossing. They installed tire chains, reinforced the chassis, and added extra weight to improve traction on ice. Tommy Jackalone oversees security for the operation. The 26-year-old leader of the emerging Detroit crime syndicate, later known as the Purple Gang, established connections with Canadian suppliers through his cousin in Windsor. Jackalone positioned 3 armed men along the Michigan shoreline to watch for federal agents. 2 more guards wait at predetermined points in Detroit to signal if law enforcement approaches the convoy route. At 11:52 p.m., Mackenzie receives the all-clear signal from a flashlight beam across the river. The temperature has dropped to 16 below zero. The Detroit River measures 2,100 feet wide at this crossing point. Ice thickness reaches 18 inches, sufficient to support the weight of loaded trucks. The current flows at 2.3 miles per hour beneath the frozen surface, creating pressure ridges that must be navigated carefully. Mackenzie climbs into the lead truck's passenger seat. William Patterson, a 29-year-old former Overland Motors employee from Toledo, grips the steering wheel. Patterson learned to drive trucks during the Great War, hauling supplies behind German lines in France. He volunteered for the convoy after losing his job when auto production slowed following the armistice. Patterson carries a .38 caliber revolver in his coat pocket and has orders to abandon the truck if confronted by authorities. The 8 trucks begin moving at midnight. They exit the distillery grounds through a gate that opens onto Riverside Drive. The convoy turns east, following the river road for half a mile before turning north toward the crossing point. No other vehicles travel the roads at this hour. Street lamps cast long shadows across the snow-covered pavement. The trucks move in single file, maintaining 50-yard intervals to distribute weight across the ice. At 12:07 a.m., the lead truck reaches the riverbank. Patterson engages the low gear and begins the descent onto the frozen surface. The Model T's headlights illuminate a path across the ice. Wind gusts at 15 miles per hour create a wind chill of 37 below zero. The truck's engine temperature gauge shows normal operation despite the extreme cold. The ice surface appears smooth from shore, but pressure ridges create obstacles every few hundred yards. Patterson navigates around the first ridge, a 3-foot-high wall of broken ice pushed up by the current below. The truck's modified suspension handles the rough terrain. Behind him, 7 other drivers follow the exact route, staying in the lead vehicle's tire tracks. At 12:14 a.m., the convoy reaches the river's midpoint. They cross the international boundary marked by buoys frozen into the ice. Legally, the trucks and their cargo remain in Canadian custody until they reach American soil. Customs and Border Patrol agents have no jurisdiction over the vehicles while they remain on the river. This legal technicality provides limited protection if federal agents attempt to intercept the convoy. The American shoreline appears as a dark line against the snow-covered landscape. Detroit's industrial skyline rises beyond the riverbank, smokestacks silhouetted against the cloudy sky. The city's population has grown to 993,000 residents. The automotive industry employs 150,000 workers in 47 factories. Ford's Highland Park plant operates 3 shifts daily, producing 1,000 Model T automobiles every 24 hours. At 12:19 a.m., the lead truck's headlights illuminate the Michigan shore. Patterson can see the outline of buildings along Jefferson Avenue. The planned landing point sits between 2 warehouses owned by the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company. Jacalone's associates cleared the area of potential witnesses. 3 men wait with shovels to create a path up the riverbank if the snow proves too deep. The convoy maintains formation as it approaches American territory. Each driver knows the predetermined route through Detroit's industrial district. They will separate after reaching shore, taking different roads to avoid detection. The cargo will be distributed among 7 speakeasies and 3 private customers who have already paid deposits. The entire operation should be completed by 2:30 a.m. At 12:21 a.m., Patterson's front wheels touch American soil. The Model T climbs the riverbank without difficulty. The modified suspension and tire chains provide adequate traction in the snow. Behind him, the second truck begins its ascent. The wooden crates rattle softly as the vehicle navigates the uneven terrain. Each case contains 12 bottles of Canadian Club whiskey, aged 4 years in oak barrels. Jacalone's men signal from their positions along Jefferson Avenue. The street remains empty except for 2 patrol officers walking their beat 4 blocks to the west. The Detroit Police Department employs 1,847 officers to patrol 139 square miles. At night, the force spreads thin across the city's expanding boundaries. Most officers concentrate their efforts in the downtown district and residential neighborhoods. The industrial waterfront receives minimal attention during overnight hours. The third truck experiences mechanical difficulty during the shore ascent. Driver Michael Kowalski, a 31-year-old former Packard employee, shouts that his transmission has failed. The vehicle sits halfway up the bank, blocking the path for the remaining trucks. Kowalski attempts to restart the engine while 5 trucks wait on the river ice. The temperature continues dropping, now 18 below zero. Sullivan approaches the disabled vehicle on foot. He examines the transmission and determines the problem requires professional repair. The truck cannot be moved under its own power. Sullivan makes the decision to transfer the cargo to other vehicles and abandon the broken truck. 4 men begin unloading 240 cases of whiskey. Each case weighs 36 pounds. The transfer operation takes 11 minutes to complete. Meanwhile, Patterson proceeds with the first truck toward the predetermined distribution point. He drives north on Russell Street, then west on Forest Avenue. The cargo area appears secure. None of the wooden crates have shifted during the river crossing. The modified truck handles well on Detroit's snow-covered streets. Patterson maintains a speed of 15 miles per hour to avoid attracting attention. At 12:41 a.m., a Detroit police patrol car turns onto Forest Avenue traveling in the opposite direction. Officers David Murphy and Robert Chen conduct routine patrol duties in Sector 7, which includes the waterfront industrial district. Murphy notices the truck but sees nothing unusual about a commercial vehicle traveling at night. Many businesses receive deliveries during overnight hours to avoid daytime traffic congestion. The patrol car passes without stopping. Patterson continues driving toward his destination, a speakeasy called the Bucket of Blood located in a basement beneath Morrison's hardware store. The establishment operates under the protection of Detective Lieutenant William Johnson, who receives $500 monthly payments to ignore certain activities in his precinct. Johnson provided the location with a warning system. 3 knocks followed by 2 knocks identify legitimate customers. The second truck, driven by Anthony Rossini, encounters a different problem. A federal prohibition agent named Charles Armstrong conducts surveillance from a building on Atwater Street. Armstrong noticed unusual activity near the riverbank and positioned himself to observe potential smuggling operations. He counts 6 trucks traveling north from the Detroit River at 12:38 a.m. Armstrong has worked for the Internal Revenue Service's Prohibition Unit for 16 days. The federal government created the unit to enforce the Volstead Act nationwide. Michigan receives a budget of $150,000 annually and employs 47 agents to patrol the state's 224-mile international border with Canada. The Detroit River crossing represents the highest priority for interdiction efforts. The agent attempts to follow Rossini's truck but loses sight of it when the vehicle turns into an alley behind the Michigan Central Railroad yards. Rossini unloads his cargo at a warehouse owned by Vincent Melly, a member of Jacalone's organization. 12 men transfer 240 cases of whiskey to a hidden storage room beneath the building's main floor. The room measures 12 feet by 20 feet and can hold 2,000 cases. At 12:52 a.m., the 4th truck reaches its destination without incident. Driver Raymond Kowalczyk delivers the cargo to a private residence on Russell Street. The customer, Dr. William Harrison, purchased 240 cases for his medical practice. Harrison holds permits to prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes, one of 6 legal exceptions to the Volstead Act. The doctor pays $20,400 in cash, a 140% markup from the Canadian purchase price. The 5th and 6th trucks travel together to a speakeasy called the Cadieux Café, located on the east side of Detroit. The establishment serves automobile factory workers from the nearby Dodge Brothers plant. Owner Jean-Baptiste Cadieux paid $15,000 in advance for 480 cases of Canadian whiskey. The delivery represents a 3-month supply for the café's 60 regular customers. Problems develop with the 7th truck at 1:04 a.m. Driver Stanley. Noack encounters a roadblock established by Detroit police at the intersection of Jefferson and Woodward. Officers are investigating a reported break-in at a nearby jewelry store. Captain James Sullivan, no relation to Frank Sullivan, questions drivers passing through the area. Noack provides false identification and claims to be delivering machine parts to a factory in Highland Park. The police examine the truck's cargo area. The wooden crates bear Canadian export stamps clearly visible in the officer's flashlight beams. Captain Sullivan recognizes whiskey shipping labels from his previous experience investigating liquor violations. He places Noack under arrest and seizes the truck with its 240 cases of contraband alcohol. This represents the first major prohibition enforcement seizure in Detroit. News of the arrest reaches Jacalone through his network of informants within the police department. He immediately sends word to abort further deliveries. The 8th truck, still loaded with whiskey, receives instructions to return to Canada. Driver Peter Korolowski reverses course and drives back toward the Detroit River crossing. The return journey proceeds without incident. At 1:18 a.m., Armstrong reports his observations to federal headquarters by telephone. He describes seeing 6 trucks cross from Canada and provides estimated locations for the vehicles he tracked. Additional prohibition agents receive orders to begin searching the industrial district. The federal response involves 12 agents working in 4 teams of 3 men each. The abandoned truck remains on the riverbank where Kowalski left it after the transmission failure. Detroit police discover the vehicle at 1:31 a.m. during increased patrols triggered by Noack's arrest. The truck contains no cargo, but tire tracks in the snow indicate recent heavy loading. Police find 47 wooden bottle fragments scattered around the vehicle, evidence of whiskey cases broken during hasty unloading. At 1:35 a.m., Federal Agent Armstrong coordinates with Detroit police to establish roadblocks at 12 strategic intersections throughout the industrial district. The joint operation involves 8 prohibition agents and 16 police officers. They stop 43 vehicles during the next 2 hours. Most carry legitimate cargo: steel, coal, automobile parts, and food supplies for downtown restaurants. The intensive search creates the first major law enforcement response to organized bootlegging in Detroit. Previously, Prohibition violations involved individual smugglers carrying small quantities of alcohol. The 8-truck convoy represents a new level of criminal organization that federal authorities recognize as a significant threat to enforcement efforts. Meanwhile, Patterson completes his delivery to the Bucket of Blood speakeasy. Owner Francis O'Brien pays $20,400 cash for the 240 cases, double the Canadian purchase price. O'Brien operates 3 similar establishments in Detroit and expects to sell the whiskey within 6 weeks. Individual bottles retail for $8 each, generating total revenue of $23,040 per shipment. The profit margin exceeds 300% after accounting for operating expenses. The speakeasy occupies a basement room measuring 30 feet by 40 feet. Wooden tables and chairs provide seating for 60 customers. A piano sits in one corner, where musician Eddie Tolson performs nightly from 8 p.m. until 2 a.m. The establishment serves factory workers, dock laborers, and small business owners from the surrounding neighborhood. Customers include both men and women, though women typically arrive accompanied by male escorts. At 1:47 a.m., Prohibition agents raid the Cadio Cafe where the 5th and 6th trucks delivered their cargo. Federal agents Charles Armstrong and Robert Mitchell, working with 4 Detroit police officers, surround the building and demand entry. Owner Jean-Baptiste Cadio initially refuses, claiming the establishment is closed. The agents present a federal search warrant signed by District Court Judge William Patterson. The raid discovers 390 cases of whiskey stored in the basement. Agents also find customer records indicating sales of illegal alcohol dating back 4 days, well before the current shipment arrived. Cadio is arrested along with 3 employees and 4 customers who remained in the building. The seized whiskey has an estimated street value of $37,440. News of the raid spreads quickly through Detroit's emerging criminal network. Telephone calls alert other speakeasy owners to the increased federal enforcement activity. Many establishments close temporarily or move their alcohol supplies to alternate locations. The coordinated law enforcement response catches the smuggling organization unprepared for such immediate reaction. At 2:03 a.m., Frank Sullivan receives reports about the raids and arrests. He realizes the convoy operation has been compromised and orders immediate evacuation of all remaining whiskey supplies. 12 men work to move 680 cases from the Melly warehouse to 3 different locations across the city. The emergency relocation takes 97 minutes to complete. Vincent Melly organizes the warehouse evacuation while coordinating with other members of Jacalone's organization. They use 4 additional trucks borrowed from legitimate businesses to transport the contraband alcohol. The vehicles travel separately through different routes to avoid detection. One truck carries cases to a private residence in Hamtramck, another delivers supplies to a farm in Lincoln Park. The third vehicle transports whiskey to a boathouse on Belle Isle. Federal agent Armstrong begins analyzing the evidence from the night's operations. The coordinated nature of the smuggling suggests professional organization beyond individual bootleggers. The identical trucks, synchronized timing, and predetermined distribution points indicate planning by experienced criminals. Armstrong recommends increased surveillance of the Detroit River crossing and expanded cooperation with Canadian authorities. At 2:21 a.m., Detroit police arrest 3 more individuals connected to the convoy operation. Officers find Raymond Kowalczyk attempting to dispose of empty whiskey bottles behind Dr. Harrison's residence. Under questioning, Kowalczyk reveals details about the convoy organization, but refuses to identify key figures like Mackenzie and Sullivan. Police also arrest 2 men unloading cases at a warehouse on Michigan Avenue. The arrests provide law enforcement with their first detailed information about large-scale alcohol smuggling across the Detroit River. Police learn about the Canadian suppliers, the modification of trucks for ice crossing, and the existence of an organized distribution network. This intelligence leads to expanded surveillance operations and coordination with federal prohibition agents. Tommy Giacalone recognizes that the convoy operation represents both a success and a significant security breach. 6 trucks successfully delivered their cargo and generated over $100,000 in revenue. However, the law enforcement response demonstrates that future operations require better planning and security measures. The arrests also create potential for informants within the organization. At 2:44 a.m., the final truck returns to Canada. Driver Peter Kowalski crosses the Detroit River without encountering law enforcement. The return journey takes 14 minutes. In Windsor, James Mackenzie and Canadian associates unload the 240 cases and transport them back to the Hiram Walker Distillery warehouse. The whiskey will be held for future smuggling attempts. The night's operations result in the successful delivery of 1,440 cases of Canadian whiskey to American customers. Total revenue reaches $122,400, generating a net profit of $73,920 after expenses, including truck purchases, driver payments, and bribes to corrupt officials. The profit margin of 92% encourages Mackenzie to plan additional convoy operations. However, the law enforcement response changes the dynamics of cross-border smuggling. Federal agents now maintain regular surveillance of the Detroit River. Police increase patrols in the industrial district. The joint American-Canadian investigation begins sharing intelligence about smuggling operations. These developments force bootleggers to adopt new tactics and routes. At 3:15 a.m., Stanley Nowak provides detailed information to federal agents in exchange for reduced charges. He identifies James Mackenzie as the convoy organizer and Frank Sullivan as the operations coordinator. Nowak also reveals the Canadian supply source and describes the truck modification process. This cooperation leads to arrest warrants for key figures in the smuggling organization. The information provided by Nowak enables law enforcement to understand the full scope of the operation. Federal agents learn that the convoy represents the first attempt at large-scale truck-based smuggling across the Detroit River. Previous operations involved individual vehicles or small boats. The 8-truck convoy demonstrates the criminal organization's increasing sophistication and ambition. February 13, 1920, 6:30 a.m. Federal Prohibition agent Charles Armstrong completes his incident report at the Detroit field office of the Internal Revenue Service. The document describes the first documented case of organized truck convoy smuggling across the international border. Armstrong's report recommends immediate expansion of enforcement resources and coordination with Canadian authorities to prevent similar operations. The convoy's partial success alarms federal officials in Washington. Treasury Secretary David Houston receives Armstrong's report by telegraph at 9:47 a.m. The operation demonstrates that criminal organizations can transport large quantities of alcohol across the border using motor vehicles. Houston authorizes hiring an additional 25 Prohibition agents for the Michigan Border Patrol and requests increased funding from Congress. In Detroit, Police Chief James Inches convenes an emergency meeting with federal agents to discuss the smuggling operation. The meeting includes representatives from the Detroit Police Department, the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, and the U.S. Customs Service. They establish a joint task force to combat organized bootlegging and agree to share intelligence about criminal activities. The task force creates new protocols for patrolling the Detroit River border. Officers will maintain 24-hour surveillance during winter months when the river freezes. Police boats will patrol during summer months to intercept water-based smuggling attempts. Federal agents will coordinate with Canadian authorities to monitor export activities at border distilleries. James Mackenzie evades immediate arrest by remaining in Canada, where American authorities cannot extradite him for violating U.S. prohibition laws. However, Canadian officials begin investigating his activities under pressure from American diplomatic requests. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police establishes surveillance of the Hiram Walker Distillery and other potential export sources. Frank Sullivan flees Detroit after learning about Stanley Nowak's cooperation with federal agents. He relocates to Toledo, Ohio, where he organizes similar smuggling operations using boats on Lake Erie. Sullivan's Toledo network eventually grows to include 37 vehicles and generates over $2 million annually in illegal alcohol sales. His escape demonstrates the difficulties law enforcement faces tracking criminals across state boundaries. The arrested drivers receive varying sentences based on their cooperation with authorities. Stanley Nocum pleads guilty and receives 6 months in federal prison plus a $500 fine. Raymond Kowalczyk refuses to cooperate and receives 2 years imprisonment plus a $2,000 fine. Michael Kowalczyk receives 1 year imprisonment after his truck breakdown provides evidence of the smuggling operation. Tommy Jackalone adapts his organization's tactics in response to increased law enforcement attention. He recruits corrupt police officers to provide advance warning of raids and roadblocks. The Purple Gang begins using boats during summer months and develops new routes through rural areas of Michigan. These adaptations lead to expanded criminal operations generating millions of dollars in revenue. The convoy operation establishes precedents that shape prohibition enforcement throughout the 1920s. Federal agents recognize that criminal organizations will use motor vehicles to transport large quantities of alcohol across borders. This leads to expanded surveillance programs, increased funding for prohibition enforcement, and new technologies including radio communication between patrol units. On February 28, 1920, Congress passes emergency funding legislation providing an additional $2.5 million for prohibition enforcement along international borders. The Detroit River receives priority attention with $400,000 allocated specifically for Michigan operations. The funding supports hiring 150 additional agents, purchasing patrol boats, and establishing permanent surveillance posts. The success of the convoy operation encourages other criminal organizations to attempt similar schemes. During the following winter, federal agents document 47 truck-based smuggling operations across the Detroit River. The increased activity leads to an enforcement arms race as criminals develop more sophisticated tactics, while law enforcement expands resources and capabilities. Hiram Walker and Sons Distillery faces increased scrutiny from both Canadian and American authorities. Company officials claim they legally export alcohol to foreign customers and cannot control what happens after products leave their facilities. However, the company reduces exports to border warehouses and implements new record-keeping requirements to satisfy government investigations. The economic impact of the convoy operation extends beyond immediate criminal profits. Successful smuggling operations increase alcohol availability in Detroit species, reducing prices and expanding customer bases. This generates employment for bartenders, musicians, security personnel, and other service workers in the illegal alcohol industry. By June 1920, law enforcement agencies estimate that truck-based smuggling operations transport over 50,000 cases of alcohol monthly across the Detroit River. The volume represents approximately 600,000 bottles of whiskey, gin, and other spirits. Street value of the monthly shipments exceeds $4.8 million, demonstrating the scale of criminal enterprise that developed from the initial convoy operation. The lasting impact of the first Bootleg Convoy extends far beyond its immediate results. The operation demonstrates that prohibition cannot be effectively enforced along porous international borders. Criminal organizations adapt quickly to law enforcement tactics and develop increasingly sophisticated smuggling methods. The cat-and-mouse game between bootleggers and federal agents becomes a defining characteristic of the Prohibition era. The Detroit River Corridor becomes the primary entry point for illegal alcohol entering the United States from Canada. Federal estimates indicate that 75% of contraband liquor crosses through the Detroit-Windsor area during the Prohibition years. The geographic advantages that made the first convoy possible, short crossing distance, industrial cover, and extensive road networks, continue to benefit smuggling operations throughout the 1920s. The convoy operation also influences the development of organized crime in America. The profits generated by alcohol smuggling provide capital for criminal organizations to expand into other illegal activities. The Purple Gang uses bootlegging revenues to finance gambling operations, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. Similar patterns emerge in other cities with active smuggling operations. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. The legal alcohol industry resumes operations, eliminating the economic incentives for smuggling. However, the criminal organizations that developed during Prohibition continue operating in other illegal enterprises. The organizational methods and corruption networks established during the bootlegging era provide foundations for organized crime activities that persist for decades. The first bootleg convoy crossing the Canadian border on February 12, 1920, marked the beginning of 13 years of large-scale international alcohol smuggling. The operation's partial success and law enforcement response established patterns that defined prohibition enforcement throughout the 1920s. By dawn on February 13th, the economics of illegal alcohol and the realities of border enforcement had permanently changed.